Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning yerushalmi, sheviis, Perek Yud, Halacha Gimel, and God willing, Halacha Dalid. We are learning the second to last daf in the Masechta, daf Pei Vav. We left off on daf Pei Hey Amid Beis, 2 lines before the bottom of the Amid, and we left off prior to that by the Gemara quoting a Braisa, in which we have a machlokes Tanoim between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosi. What do we do with a document that has the month calendar date recorded in it? And when we look at that date, we realize that that date was Shabbos or Yom Kippur. And we know it's a given that the document was not written and signed, God forbid, on Shabbos and Yom Kippur. And therefore, either it was a predated or it was a post-dated document, l'chu'ura. And as we learned before, that a predated loan document is invalid, right? Because it gives the lender more rights, it enhances his rights illegally. So Rabbi Yehuda says that this document that's dated with Shabbos or Yom Kippur is kosher. Rabbi Yosi says that this document is puzzle. We left off in the middle of that. The Gemara is going to make it clear that it's not that Rabbi Yosi holds that since we don't know whether it's pre or post, we assume the worst, but there's another reason for which Rabbi Yehudi dismisses the document, he invalidates the document, as we'll see when we learn the Gemara. Now, on Daf Pei Vav, we're going to go back to the rule of the Mishnah that ein koisven prusbel ella al karka, and we're going to have some elaboration both on the case when you have an apitropos, where you have a guardian that's looking over administrating the properties of orphans, and the case where a husband himself who doesn't have property, but his wife brought property into the marriage, but she retained ownership of that property. That's called nichse melug. And the Mishnah says that even though the husband doesn't own that property, nevertheless, if he's the borrower, that suffices for a prusbel to be allowed to be written. We're going to have a lot more elaboration on both of these cases. The Gemara is also going to go back to the case of the Mishnah regarding the beehive, where we have the machlokes Rabbi Lezer and the Chachamim. Rabbi Lezer says it's considered land, and there are 4 consequences, and the Chachamim say that it's not considered land. We're going to have a very interesting discussion about that, and what will come out is some huge chiddush in today's daf, that again, even though we have the rule that ein koisven prusbel ella ala karka, if the borrower only has borrowed land, for sure if he has rented land, even if it's only borrowed land, that's enough land for the lender to be allowed to write a prusbel. And finally, when the Mishnah was speaking about the last case in the Mishnah, that if someone is a manslaughterer and he comes to the Ari Miklat and people want to bestow honor upon him, he's obligated to say that Amar Tzeyach. And if the people say, nevertheless, we want to give you honor, that's okay. So we're going to learn a little bit about the person's, the ethics of one declining honor that's not due to him or to her. Halacha Dalid, which God willing will begin today, is going to give us various scenarios where Chazal use the expression Ruach Chachamim Noicha Heimenu, which means that the spirit of the rabbis are happy with one's behavior. We're speaking about a behavior that's beyond the letter of the law. One of the cases will be about taking payment from a loan for which there was no prusbel written, and there are going to be 2 other cases in the Mishnah. We'll leave it at that, and let's dive right inside. Chevra daf Pei Hey Amid Beis, again 2 lines before the bottom of the Amid. Remember the machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosi. Again, the document we realize was dated on a month calendar date that we know was also Shabbos. And Rabbi Yehuda says it's kosher, and Rabbi Yosi, the Tana Rabbi Yosi, says that it's poisel, and l'chu'ura, as we learned yesterday, that as we learned 2 days ago also, that a loan document that's predated becomes invalid, and l'chu'ura Rabbi Yosi is concerned that it was predated. So let's read it inside. Have a boy in Meimar, right by the dot, the last word of the second to last line, going into the last line of Daf Pei Hey, that originally the Chevra in the yeshiva understood that man, the Amar Pasol, Rabbi Yosi, who invalidates this document, is because he presumes, Mishum, we have to go with the version Mugdam, that it's a predated document. In other words, one thing to make it clear, if the holder of the document, the lender, could prove that it's not predated, then he'll be able to use it. But when the Beis Din sees the document, since we know it was not written on the date that you have in the document, then the Beis Din presumes the worst. That is what they thought. And daf pei vav. And consequently, Uman de Amar Kosher, that Rabbi Yehuda, L'chora, why does it say kosher? Mishum ocher. Because again, when you know it wasn't written on its date, so why are we presuming the worst? Presume the best. However, says the Gemara, that's not accurate. They concluded in the Gemara when the Chevra were discussing this Tana, this Braisa, Elaman, the Omar Pasol, Rabbi Yosi could agree with Rabbi Yehuda. You don't presume the worst. You presume the best. It was a post date. It was written on Friday, and they put the date for Shabbos. And by the way, it makes a lot of sense because we all know, right? We are Sheviis Shabbos. At some point Friday, you're so into Shabbos that you're ready. For you, it's already Shabbos, right? No, we taking Shabbos early. There's a logic to say that when a document is written Erev Shabbos or Erev Yom Kippur, you're already right. For you, it's already Shabbos or Yom Kippur. But not speaking halachically, you were not Makabel Shabbos. It's before Plaga Mincha, but your mind is already in Shabbos. The problem is that since the date is not accurate, that arouses suspicion that the whole thing is forged, not that the date is wrong. Elamando Amar Pasol Mishum Ziyuv. That's the problem. And therefore, again, to make it clear, since the conclusion was that Rabbi Yosi doesn't presume that it was predated. No, it was post-dated. It was written on Friday and they wrote the date of Shabbos. Written Erev Yom Kippur, but they wrote the date of Yom Kippur. Post-dated loan document is good. Problem is, because the fact that something is off with the document, Beis Din has to presume something is off with the entire document. That's why he says it's invalid, just to conclude, which would mean that if the lender can authenticate the document, if he can notarize the document, then even Rabbi Yosi will hold the document is okay. And notarizing the document doesn't mean he has to prove that it was post-dated. No, that we can presume it was post-dated. Everyone knows you can't predate a document. That was the conclusion in the Gemara. Yes, Keva.
I was just going to say, if we get the witnesses, it's all set, right? That's what you just said at the end. If we find...
That's the whole point, exactly. In other words, it's not invalid. You know, there's another concept that we learned a lot, that a shtar shemezuyev mitoichai is invalid, because the document becomes invalidated. We don't say that regarding dates. Because if the only problem is the wrong date, and if it's post-dated, then it's good. Okay. Now, the Mishnah said, going back to the Mishnah, Ein koisim pruzbul ela ala karka. That Hillel made a takana, very nice. He made it very easy to circumvent the rules of Shemitah. Okay, but the borrower, that's the way when we learned the Mishnah, we kept on repeating, the borrower has to own land. And we learned really a machloikis tanoim, a machloikis rishonim that we quoted from the Marafulda and from the Rashirilio. Either like Rashi says that the Rashirilio quoted, we learned this yesterday, that the Chachamim only make a takana al milsa de shchicha, and it's only when lending or borrowing money normally only happens when the borrower has land as collateral, or you have the concept that land, since the land is linked to a loan, and the rule is that when you are malva al hamashkoin, there's no shmita at all because the lender already collected. So Hillel's takana also was based on the understanding that if there is land, it's as if it was collected, but there has to be land. So we kept on emphasizing when we learned the Mishnah, both understandings of this rule is all based on the presumption that the land has to be owned by the borrower. Now we'll see in the Gemara, it's really a machlekes amaroyim. Rav Amar, Rav says, you know what the Mishnah means? That there has to be land. V'hu sheyia karka both lamalva ulaloiva. That's a chiddush. We didn't learn the Mishnah like way Rav learned it. Both have to have land. Why do both have to have land? Why does the lender have to have land? After all, the reasons that we gave only apply to the borrower. So look inside. Today we learned a Pnei Moshe day. The Pnei Moshe is, I think, 10 lines from the top of the Amid. Lamalva ulaloiva. The Tamei, the understanding of Rav in his understanding of the Mishnah is because the chi ein lekarka laha malve. If the lender won't have land, he won't rely on the fact that the loiva has land. And l'chayda, that should be enough. You know why? Because the loiva might sell his land. he might not have it when you want to write the prusbul, which is when the borrower needs. In other words, even Rav agrees that theoretically, it's the borrower that needs to own land. But the borrower might not have land. And what did our Mishnah write? That if the borrower doesn't have land, not a problem. The lender, right, is mizakeh, will gift to the borrower without his knowledge a little granule of land. And then the borrower has land. But for the malva to be able to do it, the malva has to have land. This is gavaldik. If the malva also has land, then he'll be good. Why? Because the malva will say to himself that even if the loiva will end up selling his land before we write the prusbul, right? I'll gift him some of mine. So the logic is always on the borrower, but the Rav says it's not enough for the borrower to have it. We also need for the lender to have land. That is Rav. However, Rabbi Yechanan Amar that either or, lamalve alfa pisha ein loiva. Why is that? Because if the loiva doesn't have land, the malva will be mezaka land. So it's enough for the malva to have land. And if the loiva has land and the malva doesn't, then the malva will give him a loan. The malva won't be concerned that maybe he'll sell the land. No, since he has the land, he's confident and he lends him the money. Okay, very good. Now the Gemara quotes a brayso that ein loy karka. What happens if the borrower? Let's go with Rabbi Yechanan. We're learning yerushalmi. The loiva doesn't have land. But the loiva, he borrowed money from Reuven. The loiva also loaned money to someone else. We learned this before. L'chayavam lekarka. The loiva is also a malva. And when he borrowed land, when he loaned money to someone else, that someone else owns land. So theoretically, the borrower, when he'll come to collect, he can collect land, so he owns enough land, which is his lien in the land, that it's enough. And this is something that we call Shibuda de Rab Nasan. We had this chevra just recently in Daf Pei Daled Amud Beis, because it's considered as if the lender of Reuven, Shimon, Levi. Reuven loaned money to Shimon. Shimon doesn't own any land. Shimon also loaned money to Levi. Levi has land. So what are we saying? That for Reuven to write a prusbul, there has to be land. There is land. Who has land? Levi has land. What does it have to do with Reuven? Shibuda de Rab Nasan. Says the Gemara that again, the Mishnah says that if the borrower doesn't have land, the lender can transfer, can gift to him some land. Rabba b'Shem Rav says that the Misha ein lo ela kelach echad b'terech sodeu. If you only have one stalk of cabbage, then koisvan loy prusbul, you can write a prusbul. Oh, why is that? Because a stalk of cabbage is like land. And who made that comment?
The land it's on? Does the stock come with the land it's on?
No, even if he doesn't own the land, but since it's connected to the land, someone made this comment. I think Vlad made this comment. Someone made this comment when we were learning yesterday about the beehive. No, it's the vart of the beehive, as the Gemara is going to come back to it in a moment. You don't own the land. If Rab Lezer who holds that the beehive is land, so you own the beehive. So someone made a comment, so the same thing should be with the tree, which is exactly what the Gemara is saying. Not even a tree, a vegetable, a cabbage. Since the cabbage is connected to the ground, it's as if it's enough land for us to be able to write a prusbul. Frag the Gemara, hold on. V'hatani, but did we not learn in the Mishnah? I'm sorry, in a brayso, 3 scenarios, either partners, which is amazing. They in partnership own land, but no one has a specific part of the land. Each own, a partnership. They both own the land together. V'ho'arisin, sharecroppers. The sharecroppers don't own the land. They have rights to a percent of the produce of the land. Or v'hapitrupin, or guardians. Guardians, we're not speaking about the case of the Mishnah. We're speaking about an apitrupis who he himself has no land. If he took a private loan, he's the borrower. Even though he has some rights in the land of the orphans, because he's administering their land, he does not own their land. And the Braisa writes that none of these people ein lahem prusbul. So, and the Maraf full, the middle of the Amid, around 13 lines from the top, he explains by each one that the Hatani ein lahem prusbul, hashutvim, why not? They both own land together, because ein hakarka miyuchad lozeh, oy lozeh, because no one has their part of the land. They both own the land together. It's amazing, right? Even though we said it, if you have a kol shehu, it's enough, but you have to know what you own. If you don't have a specific part, then can't write a prusbul. What's the problem both with sharecroppers and apitrupsin? Ein lahem karpa, because she'eina shalahem, it's not theirs. They have rights to it, but it's not theirs. Lefikach ein lahem prusbul. So what's the problem with that? The Gemara is asking in the question that if owning only a single stalk of cabbage is considered land ownership, doesn't make sense by the partners. We're not going to the others or to the apitrupis. There, they own nothing. Here they own. They both own together a $10 million piece of land. Each one owns $5 million of it. What, that's not as valuable as one cabbage? So the Gemara says, no, it's not. And they answer, Taman over there, by partners, Kol, Kelach, V'Kelach, Shel Shut V'Su, nothing is owned on their own. He can have the worth of $5 million, but there isn't a single piece of land that he says, this is exclusively mine. But over here, by the cabbage, sin shaloi, that little is fully his, and that's what we need. We need for something to be fully yours. Yavaldik. Okay. Now, the Gemara wants to know, so what happens if, again, the Mishnah spoke, this is important, the Mishnah spoke about a case where the orphans did not own land.
Can I answer your question?
Yes.
Isn't there, like in halacha, there's a distinction as how you look at partnership, whether I own half and you own half?
Very good. Okay, very good point.
Both own everything. So that wouldn't that kind of come into play in this discussion? Because if I own mine and you own yours,
100%. Danny's saying very good, right? We learned many times in the Bavli. I think it was we learned on Bava Basra Daf Yud Gimel by the sugi of goydoi egoid, which is partnership dissolving their partnership. Had the formula that you have to use. So that I think that's the ground zero, at least that we spoke out. That's in yeshiva where I learned the whole topic of two ways of understanding partnerships. Either each one owns half, we just don't know which half they own. Right, then there's Bereda or not Bereda, right, retroactive, or each one owns the entire land. So Danny is pointing out that if we would understand that each partner owns everything, just because you also own, it doesn't take away my ownership. Not that I own half, I own it all, and you own it all. L'chayra, that will play into the logic of our Gemara. Okay, it sounds from our Gemara that none of them own full ownership in any part of it. They all own half of every single part. And therefore, when you dissolve a partnership, it's not possible to say Bereda, because then you are actually changing their ownership going forward. It's not like I owned half fully and you owned half fully, I just don't know what's mine and what's yours, and the division of the partnership makes that clarification. No, before we dissolved our partnership, I owned half of every part. And now that we dissolve our partnership, I will now acquire half of every part. I have to acquire something.
So for principle to work, I need to own something, even if it's minute.
Something fully. You have to own something fully. Yeah. Yes. Clear. Okay. Now, the next case of the Gemara wants to know, unlike in the case of the Mishnah was that alone the borrowers were the orphans. I mean, they were minors. So the apitrupis, he borrowed money for the orphans. The orphans did not own land. The apitrupis owned land. That was the case of the Mishnah. Here, the Gemara's kasha is the apitrupis is the one taking a loan for himself. But there's a havamina that since the orphans own land, perhaps the fact that he administers their property, that somehow should be enough for us to say that he owns land. Look inside the Pnei Moshe. Pnei Moshe is 4 lines before the end of the narrow lines. That's the case here. That they borrowed for themselves. The administrators, the guardians, the custodians of the property of the heirs, they don't own any land. That's the Gemara's kasha. And the Gemara says, we have that in our Mishnah. How do we have that in the Mishnah? Says the Gemara, in the Mishnah it says that the Mishnah gave a case where a man who's married, she did not bring in property that he owns during their marriage. Not nichse tzayim barzel. Nichse melug, we said. In other words, she owns it. All he has the user fruit to it. And he is administering the land, but it's not his. Nevertheless, the Mishnah says that since he has some access to the land of his wife, it's enough for us to write a prusbul for the husband's debt, even though the husband doesn't own anything. L'cha'ira, the same thing should be when it comes to the guardian, right? So the Gemara says, right? Now, I just want to point out that l'cha'ira, you can ask, one is not connected to the other, because the husband has rights in the property while he's married. He can have user fruit. The apetropis has no rights. He cannot use anything from the property of the orphans. But the Gemara's comparison is because the reason why the husband can have a prusbul written for his loan when the husband is the borrower is not because he has user fruit. User fruit is not land. It's because he's the guardian. His guardianship over land is enough for us to say that he has land. Guardianship, the apetropos also has. Okay.
Rabbi, aren't these different kinds of guardianship?
Yes, they are.
You guard your wife's land, okay, you own, theoretically, you derive a benefit from it.
I just said that.
From an orphan, or you guard an orphan's property, what's your...
Well, okay. Let's say like this, Vlad. When the apetropos gets paid a salary, the salary comes from the land of the orphans. In other words, he has some benefit from it.
Oh. Can the orphans say no?
That's a good question. I would say I would differentiate between whether the father appointed the apetropos, and then there's a mitzvah to follow through with the father's will, versus if the Beis Din is the one deciding what to do. I think the orphans have a much greater say if they complain to the Beis Din and they tell the Beis Din, we don't want to deal with that guy. Okay, let's go right. Next question is the opposite case. What happens if a woman borrows money? The woman doesn't own any land. Her husband owns land. Do we say that since she's married and her husband owns land, could you write on that a prusbul? So the Gemara says, that will be the case of the apetropos in the Mishnah. Nishmeina min ado. That the chayli yisoyim amal nichsei apetropos. And what was the case over there? That the orphans borrowed money. Money was borrowed on behalf of the orphans. The orphans have no land. The apetropos privately has land. And the Mishnah says that you could. No, the husband and the guardian and the custodian, the apetropos, are equal. They're similar. So the one that's benefiting from the husband, the woman, should be like the orphans benefiting from the apetropos. And therefore, it's considered that they own land for you to be able to write a prusbul.
Right. Doesn't she own the value of the ketubah versus...
No, nothing to do with the ketubah this. Simply by the fact that her husband, who's responsible for her well-being, he owns land. She's not an individual person. She's connected to someone who's responsible for her. That's why we transferred the man responsible's land to the wife.
Since the ketubah mentions land in it, she can use the ketubah as a repayment for her, the worth of...
No. In other words, okay, I would say that what Dan is asking is a good kasha. Every woman has ksuba and a kavan. Every woman is owed ksuba if there will be a divorce, and every ksuba puts a lien on the land. That's written in everyone's ksuba. It puts a lien on everything. I mean, from the times of the Go'onim, it puts a liens on movables, on the shirt off your back. By the times of Chazal, the ksuba was not lien to movables, but it was lien to land. And we just said before, because of Shibuda de Rab Nosson, forget that since she has a lien on land, the borrower is also a lender. We already established that you can write a ksuba.
Yeah.
So in other words, why does the Gemara have to ask a question? Why does we have to bring the Why isn't it enough that there is a lien from the ksuba? That's a good question. Okay, right. I don't know. Let's go back. The Mishnah spoke about the beehive.
Rabbi, sorry, but that kind of gives straight to my previous question, because they have husband and wife have a different relationship than a guardian. The level of relationship.
I know, Vlad, I know that. But the way we have to learn is that I know that what you're saying is correct. You're saying correct. The fact that the Gemara compares one to the other, the Gemara's understanding is that the relationship of the guardianship in itself, the fact that one is responsible for the other, that is what does it. And that's common. The guardian is responsible and the husband is responsible. Okay, the Kaveras divided. So let's review the Mishnah. We have Machlekes Rabbi Lezer in the Yerushalmi. It's really Rabbi Eliezer. We omit the Aleph. So there were 4 dinim, right? Rabbi Lezer says it has that the beehive that's man-made. We said that it's laying on the ground. It's not physically connected to the ground with clay. He holds it has a din of real property. So the type of kinyan is kesef shtar chazaka, not hagbah. Number 2, that is land for which you can write a prusbul. Number 3, it's not makabel tuma. And then the biggest chiddush was menigei hilchos Shabbos, that if you remove honey from the beehive on Shabbos, says Rabbi Eliezer, you're chayiv chatos. You're doing an act of detaching something connected from the ground. The Chachamim argue on all 4. Bottom, they argue with one thing: a beehive that's on the ground is not considered connected to the ground. Now, says the Gemara, Rabbi Bo b'shem Reb Shimon ben Lakish, time of the Rabbi Eliezer, needs a source. It's a big chiddush. Source is, now here's a fantastic story that we know many times. I think there's a haftarah about it. And that is that prior to one of the battles that Shaul HaMelech engaged with the Pelishtim, he adjured, he was mashbia, all of the soldiers, that no one is allowed to eat. It's a fast day. They can only eat at night. His son Yohanan did not know of that Shavuot. He didn't know. And he was with a walking staff. And there was honey. And the staff went into the honey and he was hungry. So he ate some of that honey. It was a very sad story. What happened over there? So as it says, time of the Rabbi Eliezer, and if you want to read in the Torah Oir HaShalom, you can read the whole pasuk. I'm reading the pasuk inside in Shmuel. Vayavei ha'am el hayar, the nation, these are the soldiers, they came to a forest. V'hine heilach devash, that's the pasuk over here. And here we have a honey. The ein masik yodei el piv. No one was eating of the honey. They needed the nourishment. They needed sugar, but no one was going to put it in their mouth because ki yodei ha'am es hashvua, because they were aware of the fact that they're going to keep to the oath. However, let's go in the next verse in the Torah Eira Shalom. The Yonasan Lishama, he did not hear Bahashbiya Ave V'Soam, that his father adjured the people. And what did he do? Vayishlach Esketsei Hamata Shebiyadei. He took the tip of the stick that was in his hand. Vayitbol Oisa Biya'arois Devash. He dipped it into the forest of honey. Vayoshev Yodei El Piv, and when he put it back into his mouth, he was already becoming dark-eyed. His vision was being affected because of his hunger. And Vato'orno Einov, and his eyes lit up again. Parenthetically, even on Yom Kippur, right, halachically, if someone's vision becomes impaired because of the fast, they have to break their fast. But coming back over here. So since it says in the Gemara, Vayovei ha'amel hayar v'hinei heilach devash, is a raya that a beehive is connected to the ground. Says the Gemara, what's the proof? Explains, Amarav Mana, he explains that chur shamapik devash, that's Belashon Bitniya. What do you mean a forest of honey? Does a forest produce honey? No, forest doesn't produce honey. That's a remez that just like trees, a forest produces trees. That honey from a beehive are like trees in a forest, meaning they're both considered connected to land. Says the Gemara that I would have preferred for the source to have been a later verse. The Ilu Amar, if instead of him just quoting the pasuk V'hinei heilach devash, that there was an oozing of honey in the forest, that in itself is not so strong. Like we mentioned, okay, there was honey oozing out of the forest because, in the forest there were beehives, and in the beehives there was honey. But the better proof would have been Vayitbol Oisa Biyadas Devash, that he dipped it in a forest of honey. That's already impossible because a forest of honey doesn't make sense. Then Ya'os. And indeed, the Gemara says that I want you to know that I have another tradition in the name of the same Reish Lakish, but not Rabbi Abo, but Rabbi Yosi ben Abun says, no, that is what Reish Lakish said. That Shamat Yosei Kain, that's taka how he learned it. He quoted the pasuk, Vayitbol Oisa Biyadas Advash. Okay, now when we spoke it out and we read it in the Marafulda, that's really a Gemara. The Gemara clarifies, man nan kaimin, what type of beehive are we talking about? If it's a beehive that's attached to the ground, we're speaking about that the people who made the beehive, they attached it to the ground with clay, with tit. Then kol ama moide shike karka, there will not be a machloikas tanoim. Everyone will agree that it's part of the land because of the rule kol amachuber lekarka kekarka. We gave a good example yesterday when you do construction. I'm not talking about something natural, man-made. A home is considered karka without any of the land because it's mechuber lekarka. Daf pei vav amid beis. On the other hand, if the beehive was placed on pegs, like Kevan kept on bringing pictures yesterday, even if it's connected with clay to the pegs, still, it's not directly on the ground. Kol amamoide that she'ena kekarka. Ela ki nan kaimin, where do we have the machlokes in our Mishnah? When it's bimunachas al gabe yakarka, it's resting on the ground. Eloma, it's not attached to the ground with clay with it. Says the Gemara, the asya ka'ayin, and this comes out like that which Rab Ze'era says in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah. That what? Now this is a big chiddush. That koisvin prusbul al mekoima shal tanur va'al mekoima shal kira. Quite amazing. So if you have an oven, the oven was very wide on the bottom and it was basically closed on the top. And a kira is a type of stove top that a side of people also using the inside of it as an oven, but there's a very wide opening, wide enough for you to place not one but two pots. That's called a kira. And it says, B'Shem Rabbi Yirmiyah, that if the borrower has a tanur or a kira, and it's resting on the ground, they don't own land. They don't own land that just because it's resting on that, they own the tanur. That does not allow you to write a ksuba, a prusbal, I'm sorry. In other words, clearly we follow the chachamim that if something is resting on the ground, something man-made, and it's not physically connected to the ground, it's not karka. Elama, if let's say I'm the borrower and I have a tanur, but I put the tanur in your backyard, and you allowed me to put it in your backyard, like we spoke out in our introduction, this is a big chiddush, that even if someone only has borrowed land, they can write a prusbul. So since you gave me permission to put my tanur or kira on your property, so that means I have property. That's why you can write a prusbul. Gewaldig. So understands, there are two ways of learning the... Yeah.
Sorry. In this case, if you move it, it breaks completely. It's made out of bricks or whatever.
I don't think that's correct. I don't think Akira was made to be moved. That's not true. It's not true.
Okay.
All right. Anyways, the way we learn the Gemara, if you go inside, it's getting late. Gemara full the 9 lines from the top. Explains the Gemara here the way we just explained it, that this is a proof to the Chachamim that if not for you also having the rights to the land, just owning the tanur in itself is not enough, Kechachamim, because it's not considered land. Same idea. In other words, once you had told me that only borrowed property is considered ownership enough for you to write a prusbul, and in the case of the tanur takes up more space. The kirayim takes up a more space. Kira takes up more space, the stovetop. Even if you have a lamp, mamish, a lamp, and you laid it on the ground. So I own a lamp, and I put it in your backyard, and you allowed me to keep it there. That same logic. In other words, the fact that you gave me permission to use your land from me, that's called I own land for the din of a prusbul. Now, let's go back to the Mishnah. Let me ask you a question. If you have an oven, and the oven is on the ground, let's go to and it's not connected with clay. Rabbi Lezer, Luchura, will hold that the oven is considered land. Now what happens if there's bread in the oven on Shabbos? Will the act of being roida the pas from the oven, which is chachma ve'eina malacha, right, that we learned this in Masechta Shabbos, but will it be prohibited according to Rabbi Lezer as koitzer? L'chayda, yeah. as ridiculous as it sounds. So the Gemara asks, are we going to say that even if you have an oven that's detached, but it's laying on the ground, removing bread from it on Shabbos will be considered an Isur Doiraisa le Rabbi Eliezer, like removing honey from a beehive? So the Gemara says no. And what's the difference? That Dvash, the honey, is called Gidule Kaveres. It's called a product of the beehive. We know, Chazal knew that it comes from the pollen from flowers. Doesn't matter. Point is that the bees take the nectar and they bring it into the beehive, and the honey is produced in the beehive. The honey is produced in the beehive. It's called Gidule Kaveres. The bread is not produced. It's only being baked there. And therefore, even Rabbi Eliezer, which will hold that the oven is considered connected to the ground, removing the bread from the oven is not considered an act of koitzer.
It wouldn't be bread without the oven.
Doesn't matter. It's not called Gidule Tanur. Okay, there we go. That's the nuance. This is fascinating. Okay, weiter. Now, let's move on to the case of the Mishnah where no prusbul was written. The borrower on his own is repaying the debt. The lender, v'zeh dvar hashmita, v'zeh wants, dvar dibur, that the lender has to tell him that I am relinquishing. Hamatzar chayv b'shviis, not v'oimer, without the vav. Is oimer loy, the lender has to tell the borrower the words that mishamet ani, that I am relinquishing the debt. Now, if the borrower says afal pikain, he's allowed to take it. Now, the Gemara has a big chiddush. Rav Huna says, if the lender wants the money, he's obligated to say that I'm relinquishing. Even if he says the words I'm relinquishing with a very low tone, and at the same time he's sticking out his hand and he's telling him, pass it over, give it to me. Even though he tells it to him b'safar rafa in a low tune, and even though at the same time that he's telling him I'm relinquishing, verbally, he's making a hand gesture. V'hayamin pshuta lekabel, his right hand is outstretched to receive the debt. How gavaldik is that? He's still allowed to do it. He's still allowed to do it. As long as he's saying the words that I'm relinquishing. Huh?
What's actually going
What does
on,
that
Rabbi?
mean? Right, what does that whole thing mean? He's faking it?
Is he giving him a gift? Is that basically what's happening here?
So I want to mention two things that might be connected. There's a big machlokes in the Rishonim as how do we understand this whole case of the Mishnah. In other words, when there's no prusbul, I don't care if it's only rabbinically. So what? The Chachamim have the koyach, hefker beis and hefker. If they relinquish the debt, there's no debt. So first of all, do we understand that when the borrower is giving him the money, do we view it as a gift or do we view it as a loan repayment? That's a big argument. The words in the Marafulda here indicate that he understood that even though the loan is relinquished, which means not that there is no loan, it means that there is no way of collecting the debt. It's a debt that halachically is forever uncollectible. But if he pays it, he's paying a debt. So says the Marafulda. Now, if you want to look inside 2-3 lines under the Gemara, B'Safar Rafa, with a low tune, that even though he tells him Mishamatani, but V'yad Yemina Hoysab Pshuta L'Kabal Achoiv, it's okay. Now, so I want to answer both of you guys together. Understanding that the debt is still there, there's a prohibition to collect. It's a inherently uncollectible debt. See, that's a very big vart. So if I extend my hand, let's say I'm the lender, and I'm making a motion like, give me the money, I'm not collecting it. You're giving it to me. I just need to tell you that I am relinquishing it. I am not demanding payment. I'm not demanding payment, but I would love to get it. That's the way we understand the hand gesture. Not that you owe me, but that I'm very happy, like by a gift, when a person gets a gift. Hopefully, they should not feel entitled to it. That's horrible. But they're very happy to get a gift. So if they tell the gifter, I'm very humbled, you don't owe me anything, but I'm so happy to get it. It's al derech, that's the way you might see it. Especially if it's a debt. He's not collecting it, but he's receiving it. There's taking and there's receiving. Taking is prohibited. Receiving is gewaldig. Taking is
That's why it's a low tone, correct? He's not saying it too loud.
In other words, he's not saying it too loud because he wants it. He needs the money. He very much wants to get it. He just has to verbalize that I'm not taking it. Okay. Now, the final case in the Mishnah was, the comparison, the hekesh was v'zed devar haritzeach. Then if you have a ritzeach, and he goes to the Ari Miklat, and people want to honor him, he has to verbalize that I'm a ritzeach. Elama, like the Mishnah says, if the people say we know that, but we want to give you honor, then he can accept the honor. From here we see the following: that bar nash the tani mechala. If there's someone that's knowledgeable in one mechala literally means one food, but it means Torah food. If someone is very knowledgeable in one area in Torah, he's knowledgeable in one mesechta. And he goes to a location, people don't know him. They know him a little, and and they're giving him honor because they think he knows two mesechtas. Begin tarte. He has to tell them, I don't know two. That sarach meimar loin ano chada mechla ano chakim. I only know one mesechta. In other words, just like the ritzeach has to decline honor, even though they're honoring him for a reason, but he has to make it clear that, let's say he's a scholar. Honor me because I'm a scholar. Don't honor me because of my behavior is far from perfect. He has to make that clear. Even in scholarship itself, make sure you're not given honor beyond what you're due. For what you're due, you can take your honor.
He's in that city because he's a Rotzeach. They already know that.
Yeah, well, I would say, Kevan, that since Levium lived there, it's there's no doubt that, the way things work, there's family, right? So let's say that my sister married a Levi, and I have a good relationship with my brother-in-law. What, you think I won't move there? I can move there. I want to be with my mishpacha.
Got it.
Or Levi's daughter married I'm sure there were other people that moved there that were not manslatterers. All right, I know it's 7 o'clock. I want to just open up the next mission. Open up, and then we'll continue tomorrow, and tomorrow will be the siyum. In person. So the Mishnah says, our case, that HaMachzer Choyv B'Shvius. No, the Mishnah before was speaking about the lender. The lender has to make a declaration. The lender is allowed to take it. Now let's look at the perspective of the borrower. There's no perusbal. Is there any virtue for the borrower to return it? And let's go back to what we learned. If we would learn that it's considered a gift because the loan was canceled, then why would he give it back? But again, the L'chura comes out, there is a loan here. The Torah says that the debt is an uncollectible debt. But since there is a debt, says the Mishnah, that HaMachzer Choyv B'Shvius, that if one chooses to repay the debt, even though it went over Shvius, Ruach HaChamim Noiche Himenu. Gavaldik. And in other words, it's proper not to benefit from belongings that were not his. We have in the Frierdiker Rebbe's memoirs of the Alter Rebbe's father, Rav Baruch, how he mamish never benefited from anything that was not his. This is a virtue. Ruach HaChamim Noiche Himenu. And we have two other Ruach HaChamim Noiche Himenu. So I thought we'll finish the Mishnah. We'll stop over here. And we have enough time. God willing, tomorrow we'll finish the Mishnah and we will make a siyum to be continued.